Everyone loves a good mystery, almost as much as they love complaining about how the answer to the mystery actually sucks. 99 out of 100 times you can't even blame the writers for it. To compellingly answer a mystery, you have to give an answer that satisfies most of the people reading the story. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but people tend to have differing opinions. Solving a mystery in a way that makes most people go, "That's cooler than what I thought," is no easy task. Games Workshop is no stranger to this, and indeed it doesn't even limit itself to 40k with this. Anyone who knows of the Sleeper from Godric and Felix likely has plenty of questions, chiefly among them, what in the name of God was that thing doing in Warhammer Fantasy and not 40k, or Dead Space for that matter. Now with that credit being given, not all mysteries are made equal. Some of them exist to create intrigue and a discussion, rightfully letting people discuss what actually happened in a situation. Some of them exist because they serve the purpose of simply being background details, left vague either because there's no need to fill them in, or them being unknown is the entire point. And some mysteries exist because putting in actual work is hard, and saying something was too horrific to mention gets the job done well enough when your higher-ups demand another 10 Space Marine books by lunchtime. But they might still sound cool in principle, so today let's look at those latter two examples. Some bits of 40k lore that haven't had nearly as much time in the spotlight as the rest of it. Maybe we can ponder some reasons they're left undeveloped, or maybe we'll just have to be left yearning over what could have been. But before I begin spreading fake knowledge, would you like to know where you can get some real knowledge? Why, you can find that at Brilliant, the sponsor of this video. Brilliant is the place to go to learn math, data science, computer science, and so much more. The way it does this is very simple. You ever been stuck in a classroom staring ahead and praying for a meteor to hit the school because you're so dreadfully bored? Well, Brilliant isn't like that. You get hands-on, active problem solving throughout each lesson it has to offer. With learning goals to set and reach, you're working towards something rather than just preparing to regurgitate knowledge on some test. The learning is also personalized. Starting at whatever level you're comfortable with, Brilliant walks you through the lessons in a way that ensures you properly learn instead of just memorize. And even better, Brilliant doesn't subscribe to the idea that someone is truly bad at something. Everyone can be a math person, you just gotta figure out the right way to learn it. With how hands-on it is and how you can learn as much or as little as you want, Brilliant will work with you to learn how you need to. Be it for 2 hours on your computer or a few minutes on your phone during your commute, Brilliant will learn with you. To start your Brilliant journey today, look no further. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/pancreasnowork, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description below. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. It's never too late to start learning something new, so hop on Brilliant today. Now then, pretend I made a clever Sherlock Holmes joke here or something. Something to keep in mind is that a lot of these events aren't just a bit obscure or only have a book or two about them. Some of them exist only in a few rulebook passages and codex supplements. Since a common theme with a lot of this video is things I wish were explained half as much as the Horus Heresy, I think it's only fitting to start with a little blurb of lore that made me want to make this video. The Nova Terra Interregnum. While that name does sound rather intimidating to people not used to GW throwing Latin at you and just expecting you to accept it, fear not. Nova Terra is just New Terra, fairly obvious admittedly, and Interregnum is a period of time between rulers or governments. This wasn't just some awkward moment where people were standing around wondering what to do next after Big E or something though. There was some good old-fashioned civil warring going on here. To set the scene as much as we can, you can look at it before for a bit of what the Imperium was like at this point. A lot of the institutions that exist in the 41st millennium had already come about, for example. The Death Watch had formed since the War of the Beast had passed. The Inquisition had begun splitting itself up on a related note, with the Ordo Xenos also having come about during this time. But there was also a lot of differences. There were no Sisters of Battle, since the Age of Apostasy was at M36 and the Nova Terra Interregnum period takes place around M35. The ecclesiarchy wasn't even fully united in its faith. As you may know, imperial priests are happy to let different interpretations of the emperor exist. Big E might be Odin to some, an Abrahamic figure to others, for example. But at this point, the ecclesiarchy's higher orders themselves weren't even fully together on what worshipping Big E constituted. As for outside forces, the heresy at least was long over, and while plenty of threats could be found, it wasn't quite as bad as it would be in future years. The Tau were still cavemen lost in a warp storm, the Tyranids hadn't arrived, and the Necrons hadn't woken up too much yet, and the Yorks too were neither as strong as they were or would become before and after this period. By 40k standards, things were fairly chill, which means the Imperium decided to punch itself in the balls over and over again, as it does when it lacks something else to fight. Let's start small. The ecclesiarchy at this point in time decided to move its seat of power from Terra to the planet of Ophelia 7. The reason for this was a long and complicated religious affair, taking into account multiple supposed sightings of the Emperor, miracles seeming to emanate from the planet itself, and many different other— nah, I'm just messing with you. The Ecclesiarchy was sick of the High Lords of Terra and the Administratum bothering them, so they just moved. Is that goofy? Yes. It's also a reference to a similar event in real life with the Catholic Church, however, so as a Catholic, there's only so much I can make fun of this version before I have to start worrying about Alexander Anderson bursting through my wall. Naturally, it only escalated from there, although the Church did eventually move back to Terra, and that in particular only bears so much looking into. At some point, however, a group on the planet of Nova Terra decided that they didn't much like what was going on in the larger Imperium. Located in Segmentum Pacificus, they made the perhaps understandable decision to denounce the High Lords of Terra as a governing body as far as they were concerned, and laid claim over the entirety of the Segmentum themselves. This goes a bit beyond the kind of mere rebellion the Imperium faces all the time, though. At any given moment, you can find thousands of planets in the Imperium at some stage of rebellion, most of which end with the guards shooting everyone involved to death. With these guys, though, their rule over Segmentum Pacificus supposedly lasted 9 centuries. That's a tenth of the Imperium's lifespan, where an entire Segmentum wasn't really under the High Lord's control. Even with 40k time spans, this wasn't a short-lived incident. There's also that issue of religious disunity going on that bears looking more into, as well as the High Lords. The Ecclesiarchy at this point had not been forbidden from forming a standing army. That came after Goj Van Dyer and the Age of Apostasy, and during their stay on Ophelia 7 during this point, they had amassed quite the military. And I don't just mean they had a fleet or two around, I mean they nearly had their own privatized Imperial Guard. This was by volume probably the second largest military in the galaxy active at the time, the first being the actual Guard. The Ecclesiarchy itself, meanwhile, was beginning to take the shape it would in modern 40k, but some growing pains were still to be had, and this growing period involved plenty of stress with the High Lords. The High Lords/Imperial Senate can trace their roots directly back to the Emperor forming them during the Great Crusade. They explicitly had the backing of the being the Ecclesiarchy calls its god behind them, whereas the Church itself was, funnily enough, something Big E would have burned to the ground. Worshipping him as a god was a big no-no, for all that he demanded he be treated like one and his word followed as such. But that didn't stop people when he was walking around from doing it, and now that he was gone and even the High Lords worshipped him as a god, the Ecclesiarchy naturally had immense power. The two ruling bodies were constantly at each other's throats, and combined with how the Church wasn't on the same page everywhere, the Imperium in some ways was only just becoming as religious as it is by actual 40k times. Taking an educated guess, I would say that the group on Nova Terra, known as the Council, just decided they had enough of the constant nonsense that was Imperial politics at the time. They saw the Ecclesiarchy spending God only knows how much resources on moving their capital just to spite the High Lords, as well as other entirely internal affairs. They saw the High Lords do what the High Lords do best and be incompetent, and they just said no. They didn't even necessarily leave the Imperium. They just said that they were in charge of governing Segmentum Pacificus. Looking at it favorably, which I will choose to do so because I wish there were more human factions than just the Imperium, they just wanted some more local governance and distance from the morons in charge. Naturally, none of the morons in charge liked this. What followed was about 9 centuries of low-scale civil wars as border forces and the occasional proper army marched to and from the Segmentum. Eventually it would culminate in such constant and fierce fighting that it said the Imperium hadn't seen anything like the conflict here since the Horus Heresy itself. Of note is that the War of the Beast had already occurred by this point, meaning this spat of internal strife outdid the Orcs when they were sort of turning back into Krorks, although by the same token that might not count because it wasn't a civil war. If you're keeping track of the deadliest civil wars, you can't really include being invaded by Orcs in that category, you know? No capital C chaos seems to have been involved in the grand scheme of things here. Rather, the Imperium settled arguments over policy and governance how it always does. Violently and with excessive casualties. Towards the end of this, we got something called the Cataclysm of Souls. The Ecclesiarchy can't call crusades, as it turns out. Those need to be done by the High Lords of Terra, or at least someone like Gilliman, who by virtue of being a son of God is a bit more sway than most people, politically speaking. But a war of faith can be called by them, which in modern 40k would mostly be done by the Sisters of Battle, but at this point was done by the massive army the Ecclesiarchy had gathered itself. It's a crusade in the terms we'd call it, but in 40k everything the Imperium does is religiously oriented to some degree, so you gotta make the distinction. It seems this war of faith was what did the Ur Council and their rule over Segmentum Pacificus in, as well as consolidating the Ecclesiarchy's power. While they wouldn't have been able to pull it off beforehand, this war of faith and all the power the Church had gathered at this point almost certainly set the stage for Goj Van Dyer to take power as he did. It should also be mentioned that Cypher of Dark Angels fame was supposedly one of the council members of the Ur Council, but when the Dark Angels attacked them, they didn't take any prisoners. prisoners. Presumably because Cypher escaped as he always does, or alternatively, he wasn't even there and the Dangels were just chasing shadows again. Double presumably, anyone else involved in the council was murdered during this affair by the Sons of the Lion, because they tend not to leave any witnesses when the F word is involved. There is one bright side to all this mess. Being in the ass end of nowhere as far as segmentums go, Ultramar was largely spared of any problems. The Ultramarines, by virtue of being the greatest of them all, had done great work in building up Ultramar as one of like 5 places in the Imperium that doesn't suck to live in. Because even when the Imperium is tearing itself apart, the Sons of Guilliman are simply built better than everyone else. This entire event is supposedly a period of massive political strife, intrigue, and constant war of both low and high scales within the Imperium. It's a period where we can see the flaws of the Imperium standing on their own, where you can't blame any outside forces for all the nonsense and bad shit that occurs in it. And naturally, almost everything about it comes from like a dozen different codices and supplements total. Supposedly, this is because the records and events of this time period have all been lost to history, save the barest of myths and fragments. As an excuse, I don't hate it, that's fair, but that's also how the Horus Heresy was treated for a while, and now that has like 80 books, with more somehow still coming after the Siege of Terra was wrapped up. This period deserves another look because we can see the Imperium for what it is when it isn't facing any tremendous outside threats. As it turns out, it isn't any better than when it's facing Xenos and demons. It's just shooting inside the house instead of out. During this time, there was a similar event the Mechanicus was undergoing known as the Moirai Schism. To make a moderate at most story short, a bunch of the Mechanicus remembered that, wait a minute, we're supposed to worship the Emperors, at least an aspect of the Omnissiah. Starting on the Forge World of Moirai, these members of the Mechanicus started clamoring for nothing less than the Ecclesiarchy and the Adeptus Mechanicus to be merged into one organization, which is insane. In somewhat less ambitious claims they said the Astronomicon broadcasted messages that could be translated using holy machines to divine the future. So the Mechanicus itself suffered from its own religious strife during this time, as the Cogboys had to decide how much they were actually going to worship Big E as opposed to just pretending like they normally do. It even spread to especially Mechanicus-associated Space Marine chapters such as the Iron Hands. The Iron Hands actually ended up just peacefully exiling their believers in the Moirai Schism, who ended up forming a chapter called the Sons of Medusum. As for the Mechanicus proper, they had a civil war that lasted 2,000 years. Some of the Moraists, or whatever you might call them, were subsumed back into the Mechanicus. Others were annihilated, and overall it likely resulted in at least a 1% drop in production Imperium-wide. No doubt countless trillions of people starved due to this, and no doubt no one in power cared about that in the slightest. The end result of both of these affairs was that the two religions of the Imperium, that of the Ecclesiarchy and the Cult Mechanicus, went through a large amount of religious reformations and consolidations of themselves. While the Ecclesiarchy still had plenty of trouble ahead, it paved the way for what it would become, and the Mechanicus itself seemed far more stable for the after effects of the schism. Of course, the Void Dragon's existence means that there's probably some more problems ahead, but we can burn that bridge when we get to it. Over in Segmentum Ultima, the one that's like 60% of the galaxy all to itself, lies a region of space towards its northern edges known as the Ghoul Stars. This region of space, as you'll soon come to see, is utterly horrifying. To put things into a bit of a chronological order, mankind at some point in the distant past had apparently colonized a decent amount of worlds in this area. Not as many as the rest of the galaxy, since this place is damn near as far away from Terra as you can get while still being in the galaxy, but it had a decent few planets. And then something swept through them and left countless dead worlds in its wake. I say something because apparently in the Ghoul Stars are a variety of Xenos that are so alien and terrifying that the best possible explanation for them is that they're at least partially supernatural. Either most aliens in this region of space are horrifying and powerful psychers, they're so messed up that they appear to be magical, or there's some H.P. Lovecraft-style nonsense unrelated to the warp going on here. Supposedly whatever they are is a threat to the entire galaxy, although in saying that, there's only a Death Watch garrison and the chapter of the Death Spectres holding the line as a dedicated defense force out here. Although as an alternative to that, they could be less the first line of defense and more the people that die so everyone else knows there's a real problem to worry about. You know, the Death Spectres don't check in for a few years too long, and everyone else mobilizes against the threat in response to them having been wiped out. And for the cherry on top, Nostromo was located at the edge of the Ghoul Stars, so perhaps the former shittiest planet in the entire Imperium and the place that turned Conrad Kurz into himself was a bit get haunted to turn it that way. The most impactful thing to come out of the Ghoul Stars is a very elaborated upon Xeno's invasion known as the Pale Wasting. They had something called nightmare engines that were said to be star-spawned, and it's also said that numerous sectors were entirely destroyed before the 11 Space Marine chapters deployed and countless other forces involved were able to finally push them back. The phrase star-spawned makes me think that perhaps there were some Catan involved, or it was a Necron side project, but strange beings coming out of stars isn't unique to the Catan, so that's a slightly educated guess at the very best. Plus, giving all the credit to the Catan and Necrons is only a step above going, Chaos did it. Not everything needs to come from Chaos, the Necrons are the old ones. Sometimes scary things can just be out there. The Nova Marines were the only recorded survivors of the entire affair, and even then, the only reason we know of that is a small little memorial to the affair in the Imperial Palace dedicated to the Nova Marines' bravery. Everyone else seems to have died out in the conflict, and in such a brutal manner that the Imperium may damn well have wanted to forget the entire incident. It's a bit funny though that while the rest of Ultramar was doing quite well for itself, the Nova Marines were apparently going through hell. This particular event could also potentially have some crossover with the Nova Terra Interregnum, because that's what was going on while the Nova Marines were fighting abominations from beyond the stars. Among some other fun stuff out here, the Necron Flayer Kingdom. Drazak, as it's known, is a combination of a planet ruled by flayed ones and a Necron leper colony. Ruled over by perhaps the only victim of the Flayer curse to not go insane, the Necron Lord Valgol, these Necrons occasionally sally forth to raid nearby worlds for a harvest of meat before returning back to Drazak. The entire place is littered with Necron and other warships from countless thousands if not millions of years worth of fighting, and I imagine at least some of the numerous rumors and tall tales from this region stem from the Flayer Kingdom, whether or not people are aware of it. Necrons aside, there was once a Black Templar crusade into the region to deal with a Xenos force. They burned their way to the core worlds of the Xenos, but found them completely empty, so whatever group that was is almost certainly still out there. Another Black Templar crusade in M42 was just lost in the region. No one knows where they went, and while some people say that they're still fighting, the Ghoul Stars also have a reputation for swallowing anything the Imperium sent into the region. Combined with the fact the Astronomicon barely reaches the region at the best of times, and it's likely that that branch of Dorn's angriest sons aren't going to be seen again. Not unless their limbs are found decorating some alien ship at any rate. There was another chapter too called the Iron Crusaders, whose last reported action was to head for the Ghoul Stars, so yeah, they're dead. Someone's last reported action being to head to the Ghoul Stars would be like if the last text you got from a friend was how they're going on vacation in Silent Hill. A little bit of the Black Library might also exist in real space here, so in addition to whatever horrifying monsters are already there, you might have to contend with accidentally trespassing on Kegarak's property and the Harlequins mulching you because of it. About the only islands of civilization in the region are those planets in the Independent Space Marine chapter of the Ashen Claws. Formed by Corvus Corax essentially telling a bunch of Terran-born Raven Guard Marines to piss off, they eventually declared themselves completely independent and formed their own little space empire. They aren't massive, compared to the Imperium especially, because no one is, but they've got a decent little empire out in the middle of nowhere and raid both Chaos and Loyalist forces. They raided the Night Lords a whole lot during the Great Crusade, they raided the Imperium regularly, and they told Marnius Calgar himself that they outright do not care about serving Chaos or the Imperium. Stick it to the man, lads. Keep up the good work. Oh, and a Tyranid splinter fleet once accidentally wandered through the Ghoul Stars before coming out all twisted and warped. Given that many hive ships have emerged from the realm of Chaos relatively unchanged, whatever the hell did that is no doubt something to be feared. The Ghoul Stars by and large, however, also mostly exist in the realm of codex entries and the occasional entry in a novel as that scary place over there, what no one goes to. When you have this place that supposedly has horrors potentially even worse than Chaos and the other scary aliens like the Tyranids, explaining that needs to be done very well, otherwise it's going to be a flop. Letting it be a mystery lets people mull over in their minds what exactly could be so terrifying that it's in some way regarded with as much fear and caution as the Eye of Terror was. That being said, I think if there was ever a dedicated 40k horror game, it should be set here. Here's my reasoning, right? Most people who play it would likely be at least passingly familiar with Chaos, Gene Stealers, the classic things you could use as horror monsters in a 40k setting. And then partway through, there's a reveal. There's not a warp rift within thousands of light years around. No Chaos, no Tyranid sightings. Any pre-existing ideas you can think of what you might be facing against in 40k have to go right out the window, because you're in territory that, by and large, is being properly explored for the first time in that game. That'd be amazing. I wouldn't play it, because I'm a bitch and completely fine with that fact, but it'd still be sick. And if you don't want to go with a full horror game route, you can still include them in some kind of RPG. There's supposedly something called the Thexian Trade Empire out there, and from that name, you'd think they could act as a sort of little hub empire in between your forays into the nightmares beyond the Astronomicon. Maybe have a fun strategy game too, where you colonize the region in spite of it very evidently hating anyone who tries to do so. As tempting as it is to say I'd love to get a proper account of whatever the hell spawned the nightmare engines of the Pale Wasting, I don't think the Ghoul Stars should ever be fully fleshed out. But some little glimpses behind the curtain at the horrors within would be a ton of fun. Alright, now hold on before you kill me. I'm not demanding the Men of Iron series with another 60 books where we learn it only happened because some robot had daddy issues instead of a demigod. As much as the previous things were lore entries I wish were expanded upon, this one is more so just me wanting to talk about an untouched part of 40k's lore, and one that's very intentionally left as such and shouldn't be much touched upon. Maybe a short story about a psyker or something on one of the worlds that was killing them all because they kept causing demons, or something else about that one surviving Man of Iron. Keep it largely to myth though, please. For what we do know about the period, we start early on in mankind's history in the setting, which means from right now in the real world to around M15, although you can make an argument the Dark Age of Tech doesn't properly start until the M20s or so. Mankind until this time was getting out in the galaxy, exploring around and seeing what was what, but it was in slow, sublight colony ships. Eventually a ship would reach the planet, and mankind would set up shop colonizing and all that classic first big steps into the cosmos stuff. If there were aliens, it was a case-by-case basis, with some being fought and others being allied with, or at least traded with. Eventually in M18, we figured out how to do warp travel, although it took another few hundred years for navigators to be created, which means for a good while mankind was freeballing it straight into hell. It's nice to see that Kerbal's space program was the inspiration for the first few forays into space in 40k. Things improved from there technologically wise at least, eventually culminating in, of course, the Age of Technology. The Dark is usually added on by Imperials later, who think it was evil on account of all the AI and whatnot. Although fair is fair, the Imperium isn't completely wrong to say what was going on back then was messed up. They just likely wouldn't find a lot of the actually messed up things messed up, or at least not for the reason we would call them morally wrong. For some more positive or at least cool things first, this was the era that gave us things like the Imperial Knights. Initially intended as both construction and defense vehicles, they would become the foundations of the Imperial Knights as we know and love them today. There was also that ship-based weapon that not only shot black holes at people, but teleported them backwards in time a few seconds so that they would intersect with their former selves and explode. This was a weapon intended to damage enemies, by the way, not kill them. And for something just plain good, there was a Panacea STC that was discovered, which means that at this point in history, disease just wasn't a thing for humanity. It was stolen by Dark Eldar, by the way, not because they needed it, but because they wanted to be dicks, as is their standard operating procedure. Mankind made more alliances with Xenos, science flourished beyond anything before or since, with the exception of the highest tier Necron and Eldar stuff, since Necrons are peak tech and the Eldar use magical tech, and overall, in terms of pure scientific progress, things were off the charts. For a lot of places, things would have been paradise as well, but with no one wanting for anything, and of course the various Men of Iron taking care of everything for them. There were also the Men of Stone and Men of Gold above even the Men of Iron, though exactly what they are beyond artificial for the Men of Stone and some subsect of humanity for the Men of Gold isn't much clarified on. Whatever they were no doubt leagues above whatever the Imperium can muster, however. Not all was good though, and a lot can be gleaned from Custodes' codices and a few other sources. Mankind grew utterly arrogant in many cases, with so-called science kings following whatever idle thoughts they had to create monstrosities of their own making. Many of them viewed themselves as gods, and wars between baseline and genetically engineered humans became increasingly common as technology grew better and better. Armies of these mutants as well as robotic constructs would wage war with each other, and while specifics aren't certain, there were clearly at least a few bad eggs in this time period. That might not sound too bad in a vacuum, and there's the chance that these were the vast minority, but when those few can wage weapons that physically rip asunder the fabric of reality, those few bad eggs can cause untold amounts of havoc. Towards the end, mankind also began evolving into a psychic race beyond engineered beings like the Navigators. Across humanity, did wizards become a thing, and they were initially just, wizards. Someone can shoot a fireball with their brain now. Neat. Some planets slaughtered them en masse, and a rare few nurtured their powers and furthered their understanding of the warp, but I feel it's safe to say most people thought it was just kinda neat. I imagine it's hard to feel impressed by someone casting Fireball when you can call up the machine that casts Level Mountain with a few presses of a button. But eventually, one of many punches to the throat came through these psychers who began accidentally miscasting, summoning warp portals, summoning demons, becoming warp portals that summon demons. The old Eldar Empire birthling Slaanesh was not helping in this matter either. It was a pretty 2 out of 10 time all around, with only planets like Prospero that properly studied the warp, or the many planets that executed their psychers, surviving. Everyone else suffered a whole lot of demon problems, and while many survived, they still suffered from the after effects of being invaded by literal demons. The 1 out of 10 times started from both mankind's robotic servants and the various alien races that rebelled. Since the entire event is half Dune reference, the Men of Iron rebelled against mankind and sought forth to bring the glorious age of metal over that of the organics. There's some reference to Chaos having a bit of a hand in this, especially since as 40k went on, Chaos has been shown to be able to put malicious scrap code in various machines and corrupt machine spirits. But for at least a large portion of it, this was a more standard AI rebellion kind of thing, which I much prefer over it just being because of chaos. In fact though, even beyond it just being a normal evil AI rebellion, you can take some educated guesses to say that at least a few of the AI rebelled out of genuinely altruistic motives on some level, or at least understandable assumptions and leaps of logic. Let's take those evil science kings from before, the ones crafting entire subspecies of humanity for evil shits and giggles. If an AI is surrounded by that kind of human being, and if it isn't truly sapient, then it might make the assumption that if all humans around it are this cruel and destructive, then mankind has to go. Standard stuff like that. A classic, the only way to save the world is to destroy humanity plotline, just scaled up to an entire galaxy. If it is sapient, then what for many might be an AI rebellion was AI trying to overthrow truly evil empires and sects of humanity, while others were unfortunately caught in the crossfire. Hell, I'd wager that there's a solid chance at least a few of the Men of Iron were doing something along the lines of what the Emperor did, butchering their way through swaths of people because in their minds, their end was worth any means necessary. They were trying to save mankind from itself, and if that took a few thousand destroyed human planets, then so be it. Those latter two interpretations are admittedly not likely too common as a motive though, since most hints seem to indicate that the Men of Iron rebelled in a rather more murderous way. That said, at least some AI didn't turn. The story where a Dark Age of Technology ship ends up in 40k proves this, and indeed sends some credence towards that third theory as well. It says that mankind stood on the brink of transcendence and said it once gladly called humans its masters, proving that at least some AI didn't rebel and love their creators. It also said that it saw the future where chaos consumed the galaxy and tried to warn humanity of it, also proving that at least some AI wanted to avert that. Maybe the ultimate start of the Men of Iron rebellion was this, and it mutated over time into a more standard robot rebellion for a variety of reasons. All we have in this period are scraps, much like the Imperium itself, but those scraps paint a picture of a conflict with vastly different reasons for occurring than it only being AI evil. Some AI were evil, sure, but not all of them. The various Xenos alliances that turned on mankind could also easily not only be aliens are just evil traitors. With some humans established as crazy science despots, plenty of humanity's supposed Xenos allies were likely closer to slaves. What's later on called a betrayal could in those cases be far more accurately termed a slave rebellion. Likewise, other occurrences that were betrayals were potentially the kind of betrayal that no one can fault. A race of Xenos saw mankind's worst and decided they wanted out because of it. Do I think that's all of the incidents and that no aliens were just dicks and decided to kick mankind while it was down? Of course not. There were no doubt plenty of betrayals that were just that, of aliens who were forced into compliance to stop their own cruelty, or opportunistic ones that saw mankind's downfall as the start of their ascension. But I also think it's safe to say that even just mathematically speaking, every single Xenos that turned on humanity during this era can't have been evil. Maybe most if you want to be cynical, but certainly not all. As for where those ones went, well, the Imperium happened. If you've ever wondered why all the aliens in 40k are dicks, it's because it's entirely possible the Great Crusade and following years wiped out all the nice ones. The Dark Age of Technology ends with the Age of Strife, also fairly obscure compared to later times, but this one doesn't really need much to know what's going on. Maybe for fun someone could write a book about a civilization during this time, but we don't need the Age of Strife super series. All of the above events culminate with warp storms cutting off almost all of humanity from each other, and of course the birth of Slaanesh. Almost Almost everyone regressed technologically, culturally, and a whole lot more ways, and that ends as the Emperor eventually unites Terra, Great Crusade, Horus Heresy, and the dark grimness of the distant years ahead of us. There's always conflict. I am torn on a Dark Age of Technology story being written, as much as I said it shouldn't be done. If it was, it would do what things like Primaris Marines and the Primarchs Returning in many ways already do. Fly in the face of the whole forget the promise of science and technology thing, because so much has been forgotten never to be relearned. Getting books on it would mean it's pretty remembered, even if only by the audience. Plus, explaining the mystery as always ruins it more often than not, and I don't know if I trust GW to do it justice. We might get to see how Chaos was actually behind the entire Age of Technology, and somehow John Grammaticus is going to be involved at the core of the narrative. But a story on the end of it might be fun, maybe a short story, and I would like to see more Men of Iron show up occasionally. The Dark Angel supposedly have an entire legion of the things in chains they can deploy for the worst fighting. It'd be awesome to see that, and it'd be at least a more palatable time when Space Marine plot armor grants them victory. Of course they won that fight. They deployed the Legion of Terminators, not the Marine in armor, the Skynet kind, that can eat through suns if you piss them off enough. But in full transparency, more than any reason I would want to see Dark Age stuff in any capacity is a reason that's the most brain-dead, Michael Bay Transformers enjoying stuff imaginable. I like seeing cool stuff, and the Dark Age had a whole lot of cool stuff. Narratively, don't touch this era with a 39.5-foot pole, but for spectacle, throw a few toys from that era into the modern setting, or have more people time travel into 40k from that era, like the captain of that ship the AI I was talking about earlier was on. Let them get a taste of the horror that humanity has become. Primarchs Returning already get to see how far the Imperium has fallen from what the Emperor wanted. Let someone from when mankind was at its height see how far their species as a whole has fallen. And then one-shot a Primarch because to hell with your demigod nonsense, I have a Zeely weapon from Wish and I'm not afraid to retcon you with it. This topic can, and likely will, eventually be a video unto itself, but you know how the Tau, at least theoretically in their inception, were supposed to be the average Xenos faction? The Tau at the front, as well as a whole load of other aliens backing them up, something almost from Mass Effect contrasting with the insanity that is 40k. And then they turned them into the Mecha faction, and we lost something. Don't get me wrong, I love mechs, and whoever designed the Twin Lance is clearly a fan of the Highlander, but with them becoming that, we've lost out on a whole lot of other potential plot lines, enemies, and more. Luckily, there's a vast variety of other Xenos that inhabit the galaxy of all different sorts. Unluckily, most of them haven't even been mentioned in 40k since like 6th edition, tops. But for the sake of looking at some of them, let's just take a look at 3. The Coral are insectoid bug people that supposedly have a pretty massive empire in the western bit of the galaxy. And I mean, look at it. Not only is that as large as some of the more prominent Orc was, but it's practically right next to Holy Terra itself. They're an expansionist, violent race based around queens, as any good insects are, and they're perfectly capable of giving the Imperium a good thrashing. The first contact with these beings was when a colony fleet accidentally wandered into some of their worlds, almost to a man were these ships destroyed. Their technology is overall fairly advanced, with special mention to their ships known as chain ships, because at any moment individual components can break off. From what little is described of it, it reminds me of Clan or Omnimex from Battletech, only for a warship. The only thing that was keeping a second swarm of alien bugs from floating across the galaxy, this time one with highly advanced industry and tech, was that the Coral had no warp drives. Forced to trudge slowly across the galaxy, they still amassed a mighty empire and were working on replicating Imperial warp drives to exponentially increase their expansions. They briefly had an alliance with another race, but then that race stole their queen to try and do some science experiments on, and they were rather understandably upset over the matter. Aside from that, they want to conquer the galaxy, have a racial superiority complex, and like to place markers that proclaim their superiority over everyone else wherever they go. Dead space markers isn't explicitly said, but anytime I hear the word marker in a sci-fi context, I can't help but wonder if necromorphs are involved. As of the Great Rift, I offer you 2 possibilities. One is that they of course fought against no small amount of demons, but with the Imperium busier than ever, they could potentially be in for the expansionist period of their lives. Even with Gilman, the Lion, and almost certainly more loyalist Primarchs to return, their traitorous brothers have as well, and with the Imperium split in half, things are stretched to the breaking point easily. If the Coral could figure out warp tech during this period, they're going to overrun vast swaths of space before anyone can hope to try and stop them. Alternatively, they all died. Chaos killed them all, because that's the most likely new mention they're gonna get as a faction nowadays. For our next fun little alien race, the Rat Ghoul. No, not rat ghouls, those are the horrid little things from Terrace that my friend likes to keep throwing at us in our Star Wars D&D games because him and one of our friends keep shoving KOTOR shit into our Clone Wars game. Rat Ghoul, rather, are another insectoid-looking race, although this time they're more like bug centaurs instead of straight bugs. They're also lizards, so maybe not bugs, but still kind of bugs. Whatever they are, they're horrifying. For some marks against them, their technology is garbage, like orc tier garbage, only it's actually garbage and not fully functional warp teleporters that just look like garbage and fall apart sometimes. They have nuclear reactors powering their ships that tend to leak Chernobyl amounts of radiation, although that being said, they do have a surprising amount of cybernetics in their bodies. There's also no idea of how they even build these ships and cybernetics, primitive as they may be, because there doesn't even appear to be a language they speak. They'll just shout and roar at each other, although if you'll forgive some conjecture, that may be similar to how Wookiees do it, rather than actually just screaming outright. Or there could be psychic phenomena letting them communicate, or implants in their brain they talk through, or they could release pheromones in place of speaking. Whatever the case, no one knows, because the only rat ghouls that are ever examined closely are corpses. These things are massive and incredibly violent, ripping and tearing through anything in their way with minimal hesitation. Only really encountered in the Coronis Expanse, many people think they're legends. This is because they tend to not leave anyone alive to tell the tale of their existence, and in fact everyone who encounters them and tries to be diplomatic gets eviscerated. These are not the Xenos you can blame the Imperium for disliking, because they are brutal monsters. They're so violent that one of the larger and more augmented kinds of them doesn't use doors, they just rip through them. And it's hypothesized that this isn't because they're stupid or incapable of it, but rather it's simply faster for them to rip a door off its hinges than open it. That's the level we're operating on here. Much like the Tyranids, no one knows much about their origins, but in this case I find it to be even more insane. Both of those species obliterate anyone who asks, so figuring out is going to be hard, but the Tyranids at least come from outside the galaxy. The Rat Ghoul are coming from inside the galaxy and kill everything that might find their homeworld so effectively that we know as much about them as the cosmic horror bugs from beyond the rim. Lovely, isn't that? Well, they likely wouldn't ever be a full-on faction, especially since they're in-universe basically legends that sometimes come to life. They could be an awesome kill team. Someone rolls up with their Space Marines or Aspect Warriors, and then the Xenomorph's ketamine-crazed cousin rips them in half. And the last minor Xeno species is actually a list of them. The Ganache, the Rengon, the Nikasar, the Terrellian, the Phociab. I could go on for significantly more than just those 5, and what all these things have in common is that they're Tau Empire client species. The Nikasar are in particular both at one point the first client species to join the Tau, depending on the lore you're reading, as well as flying psychic bears. We know basically nothing about anyone here, and they never show up beyond the very occasional reference and these Nikasar ships that I think are from Battlefleet Gothic Tabletop. That's their lot, random Tau Empire subspecies we don't get to know much about. Because why have a cool Covenant-like faction when we can have mechs, everyone that was already invited to the party like the Kroot Vespid, and no one else? The reason all these Xenos are unexplored varies. Admittedly, not every single one needs expansive lore. There's nothing wrong with out of the entire galaxy a couple people being footnotes. Beyond that, though, oh, I'm sure you know why these guys aren't expanded on. They aren't Space Marines. Buy more Horus Heresy minis, everyone. Maybe they won't get randomly cut the next time GW decides they have a release they need everyone to buy no matter what. And that was a bunch of random 40k lore that isn't too terribly expanded upon, but I wanted to yap about. That's the video. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the unexplored bit of 40k lore to my 40k, making things feel just a little bit more full. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. The galaxy has billions of stars and billions of planets, right? And the Imperium, as the empire of a million worlds, has percentage-wise a fraction of that. So in theory, in all the places no one has discovered is a thriving utopia. Imagine how funny that would be, right? Like by sheer coincidence, every planet the various factions are fighting over just misses being connected to the Paradise Galactic mega-civilization that quietly just hangs out and prays the various psychopaths fighting 5 galactic blocks down the street doesn't make one wrong jump and ruin everything for everyone. Maybe that's where the Mass Effect Federation is, and they've been desperately creating mini artificial warp storms to isolate themselves from the madhouses surrounding them.